Hi, welcome. Thank you for coming. So a little bit of background on myself. Some of you may have seen me here before doing presentations, but in the past, I usually present on nutrition. I am a nutritionist, and I specialize in working with clients who've been in motor vehicle accidents, sustained primarily neurological injuries, brain injuries, spinal cord injuries, as well as orthopedic injuries. I myself, so have a bit of background. I sustained a spinal cord injury 34 years ago. So I've been living with it for more than half of my life now. And today I'm not talking about nutrition though. I am going to be talking about traveling with a disability, and I've been doing it now for 34 years. It definitely has its unique challenges. So what I'm hoping to do for maybe the next 20, 30 minutes is tell you about some of my experiences, as well as give you some tips and strategies based on my own extensive travel that will hopefully make it easier for you to get back out there and go to all your favorite destinations. So what I'm going to do is just turn my camera off for the slideshow, come back on for questions so that my face here doesn't interfere with any of the pictures. So let me just quickly switch over here, and there we go. Okay, and we will just move on with the presentation. Thank you. So we'll leave it there on the second slide. Okay, so here's a bit of background. I have always, my entire life, had a great love of travel. And I think it came from my parents, who were Scottish and English, immigrated to Canada, but was still very close to all of my family that were back in the UK. So almost every summer we would go back and spend time in the UK. And I think it really whet my appetite for travel. I really, even as a child, I loved all the different architecture, the different accents. I loved the history, the culture. I would say in most cases when I travel, I love trying different foods, definitely not in the UK because I'm not known for their cuisine, but I really just loved truly all the different sights, smells and sounds. It really just made me feel alive. So I kind of became addicted to travel at a young age. And then as I got older, my travel turned to more kind of adventure. And you can see one picture here. For a summer, I sailed on the Polish tall ship, the Gdansk, all over the Great Lakes of Ontario. And I've also sailed through the Carolinas, Bermuda. I went knapsacking as a teenager all over Europe with my friends. And I just loved it. And I was in my first year of university. I just come back from knapsacking around Europe when I had a car accident, and that's when I broke my back 34 years ago. And if we can go to the next picture, please, Rachel. So I really thought after I broke my back and I sustained my spinal cord injury and ended up in a wheelchair, that my passion for travel was going to come to an end. I couldn't see how I was going to still do what I did before. But my focus at that time was to go back to school. And I did for several years once I got out of rehabilitation, and I became a television reporter, producer, and host. And for 15 years, I hosted, reported, and produced national television shows, worked on national TV news outlets for years. And primarily my gig was reporting on disability issues. And fortunately, when I got into this career, it took me around the world. So as a reporter, as a host of various TV shows, I literally just traveled back and forth across Canada. I've been to every province in Canada numerous times. I've been to cities and towns in Canada that I've never heard of until we landed there and started shooting stories. I was really fortunate working for CBC Sports to cover a couple of Paralympic Games in Sydney, Australia, and Salt Lake City, as well as doing speaking gigs at conferences all over North America, including one I did in Moscow, which was really quite remarkable because that was really inaccessible. And the reason I actually was there speaking is about, the whole idea of getting people with disabilities more integrated into society. And what the job taught me in reporting, producing for so many years on disability issues is that anything is possible. So I really had to kind of sink or swim it when I was traveling to all these destinations and just figure out a way to make it work, whether it was in a hotel or on an airplane. And you just find ways, you learn to be innovative to make travel work. If we can go to the next slide, please, Rachel. So that was my professional experience and a lot of it with travel, but I also didn't allow my wheelchair to stop me from traveling anywhere else in the world. So here you see this slide. It was my first trip to Africa. And on this particular trip, I did 6 safaris in 5 different countries. I did like 17 flights in 1 month. On this trip, I was in South Africa, Botswana, Namibia, Kenya, and Tanzania. And it was phenomenal. And it actually ended up being more accessible than I actually had anticipated. And I can tell you more details about that once we get to the question and answer part of it. And if we can, if you're still there, Rachel, go to the next slide. I think Rachel just, there she is. There we go. This is just some more Africa slides. I've gone back to Africa 2 more times. Once I went to Egypt and did a cruise down the Nile. I always loved that movie, Death on the Nile. I saw it when I was 8 years old and always wanted to go. So I did a really accessible cruise. The cruise boat we were on, it was only 4 stories and completely wheelchair accessible room on the boat. And what was amazing about going to see the ruins, the pyramids, the temples in Egypt is when they built them, they, in order, because of the technology, we didn't have the same machinery then, in order to build the pyramids and build the temples that they built, extraordinary architecture, they had to have ramps to roll the pillars, the rocks. So it actually made it quite accessible when you're actually on site of some of these ruins. So that was a nice surprise. And then the last pictures you see here was my last safari in Namibia, which I did right before the pandemic hit 2.5 years ago. And here we did 4 safaris, including the Skeleton Coast in Namibia, which is one of the most remote areas in the world and quite extraordinary. So if we can go to the next slide, please, Rachel. There we go. So I mean, I've definitely covered a lot of ground, personally and professionally. I've been all over Canada, the US, South America, Australia, Europe, Caribbean. And I now work as a consultant for the Canadian Travel Agency in Canada. I work with a host of other organizations representing all different disability groups across Canada. And we work together with the government to ensure that all aspects of travel in Canada, and this is including planes, trains, boats, and ferries, are all universally accessible. And we're looking at all aspects within all of these modes of transportation, including the communication between your travel agent and the airline, including training and education of employees who work in the travel industry, as well as the physical accessibility of everything from the ferries to the airports to the aircrafts themselves, and making sure that they serve all needs of all people with disabilities. So I've been doing this for several years now, and there's still a lot of work to be done. We're nowhere near where we should be compared to some other countries, like the US, which are a little more advanced with us with their disability laws. They've been around a lot longer than Canadian laws, but it's encouraging to see what the Canadian government's doing in taking all the right steps to build a more inclusive travel industry so that we can all go out and enjoy our favorite destinations and travel safely with as few barriers as possible. So what I would like to do now, moving on to the next slide, please, Rachel, is just from my personal professional experience, give you all some tips and strategies that you can take with you on your next trip. So what I want to do over the next 10 or 15 minutes is just talk about how to create a stress-free, accessible holiday. And this is what I'm going to cover. It's research and planning. I do a lot of that before I go anywhere. Booking and reconfirming all of your plans with hotels, airlines, and also preparing for any potential mishaps, because they do definitely happen, and just having a couple of ideas in your back pocket of what to do if your wheelchair breaks or the hotel you book is not accessible, even though they said it was, and you get there and it's not, because that's happened to me a few times. Okay, so let's go through my tips and strategies here. On to the next slide, please, Rachel. Okay, so number one, when I'm planning a trip, I first and foremost think about destinations, accessible locations. I look for places that I know are going to be quite accessible. So I look for countries that have strong accessibility laws or cities even that have hosted Paralympic Games. You'd be amazed when you go to cities like Atlanta, Barcelona, when they've hosted Paralympic Games, it's a dream. You've got great curb cuts and accessibility in public places. It's amazing. So here's a couple that I've listed that are really quite accessible. The USA, they have a very strong American Disability Act. It was enacted over 25 years ago. So it's like freedom. I find traveling in the US, the minute you land, everything is accessible. Like it's so easy. Washrooms, ramps. You just have to shut your brain off, not worry about accessibility when you land in the US. So I do love for an easy trip going to American cities. But like I was saying, like Paralympic Games were held in Barcelona. It is remarkable how accessible this is. I spent a couple days alone in Barcelona in my wheelchair, and I cruised around, wheeled around the promenade on the beach, all over the city, went to museums, never had a problem anywhere in Spain. It was remarkable. South Africa as well, Cape Town, I found extraordinarily accessible. Australia, again, Sydney hosted the Paralympic Games in 2000, very accessible. But it's remarkable, as much as we're a very new country in Canada, there are European countries like the United Kingdom, France, that have older buildings, older architecture, but they're actually more advanced with their accessibility than even Canada. So I find it really quite easy, even going to European countries. It's counterintuitive, but their train, their rail systems, lickety split. It is remarkable how accessible they are. I found, in the UK, you don't even have to pre-book a wheelchair cabin, make pre-arrangements to hop on a train. You show up, they see you're in a chair, they've got attendants there to whip out a ramp, get you on the train. And it's second nature to how they function with people with disabilities. So we're getting there. We're working on that here in Canada. But I do find a lot of European countries a lot easier than here in Canada. So first and foremost, choose accessible locations. I also look for destinations that don't require a car necessarily all the time. I like to pick places where I can just go out of my hotel and wheel around. I don't have to be either renting a car or hopping in and out of a cab. I find it so much easier. And here's a couple destinations that are like that. South Beach, New Orleans, Savannah, Barcelona, cruise ships, all-inclusive resorts are amazing because you can just wheel around. And in these places, I've never had to rent a car. So that's tip number one. Next slide, please, Rachel. Once I've chosen my city, my destination, the next thing I do is choose my hotel, my accommodation. So I literally get onto Google and I start researching best wheelchair or best disability accessible hotels. And they start popping up, and then I start comparing prices, what's going to suit my price range. Once I've got a couple, you'll find hotels all have city maps. So I will literally, on these couple that I've selected, look at the city map, see where it's located, and see if it's close to museums or concert venues that I want to attend, or parks, things that I want to see. And that's also how I select it, because I do not want to have to be hopping in and out of cabs. So once I've now selected hotels that are in areas that are close to things that I want to do, and then I pick my top two, and then I literally pick up the phone and call them. Because even though they say they're accessible, everybody's definition of accessibility is different. So that's when I pick up the phone and I will ask them to please tell me, in their wheelchair accessible room, is it a roll-in shower? How wide is the door? And I get specifics to accommodate my own width of my own wheelchair. And I also ask about bed height. What's really unfortunate, I found over the last 5 or so years, is I call them princess beds. Hotels, I think for luxury, have started putting in beds that are all extraordinarily high. And I think it's giving this kind of luxury feel to the room. But when you're in a wheelchair, whether you're a paraplegic, quadriplegic, it can be extraordinarily difficult to transfer from your wheelchair into these very high beds. So I also ask how high the bed is. And if they do have really high beds in the rooms, I will ask them to either take it off the legs, or take out the box spring mattress underneath, so that it's a level that I can transfer onto. So here's some examples of some places I've been that are really accessible from some of the research I've done. And these aren't in places that you would think would be normally very accessible. So you can see top left picture there, that was in Namibia in Africa. So again, this particular accommodation, all flat. It was all on one level, even the little bridge over the pool there, all one level to get over there. And it was incredible. What I loved, next picture over, top second picture from, from the left, the bathroom was, again, all one level, smooth. There was no steps up into the wheel-in shower. And this was not a special wheelchair room. This was just their standard universally designed room. And this is what I find a lot in Europe or here in Africa. They just build rooms, they build washrooms that are suitable for everyone's needs. So they're universally designed. So it was amazing. Didn't matter what room I had in this particular location, it was accessible. And so you can even see next picture, the second picture from the right here, even like their infinity pool overlooking the plains, totally flat. The entire resort was flat with no steps in it at all. It was a dream. There's another resort, bottom left, another place in Africa. The entire tent and area, again, the rooms, the tent, the kind of big living quarters, they're all in one level. And this one, there was a couple steps up, but people were more than willing to kind of lift you up, get you up there. And once you're there, completely accessible. The next picture on the bottom, second from the left, this is something called the Skeleton Coast in Namibia, very, very remote. And they actually had a boardwalk, completely accessible boardwalk. We had pods for rooms, and they had a completely accessible boardwalk from one pod to the next, to the dining room. So in the most inaccessible places in the world, they've managed to make accommodations accessible. So you just have to, do a little bit of homework. And then you can see the washroom here on the bottom right. This was in an airport, a little wee airport in Namibia that we landed in, and I loved it. They had a men's washroom, a women's washroom, and a completely accessible washroom. I took a picture of it because I was blown away that this airport in the middle of nowhere had an accessible washroom, when, a lot of times in Canada, you can't find an accessible washroom. And this was solely designated accessible, and it truly was accessible. And I didn't take an outside picture, but I had a beautiful ramp leading into it. So it's just a matter of doing some homework, and you can find these places. Okay, next slide, please, Rachel. Accommodations continued here. If you're not looking for a hotel, Airbnbs are very popular now. And Airbnbs have an accessible option, which is really nice. So if you're looking at Airbnbs, always select the accessible option so you can see what comes up to help you with your search. And what I do with places like Airbnbs, because you can't just call the concierge and get measurements of doorways, I actually start looking at the pictures. And I've been living in a wheelchair for so long now, I can pretty much eyeball a picture and look at it and figure out if it's going to work for me, even though it's not deemed an accessible location. I can kind of look at it and know it'll work for me or not. Look at the doorways, the hallways. And that's just another thing you might want to do, or email the owner and ask specific questions if you're unsure. You could also, if you're on Facebook, Facebook has some really great accessible sites that you can go to and ask questions on. And I've listed a couple here. There's Accessible Travel Club. There's Airbnb Adapt. And the one I use the most and get most of my information is Virtual Peers or Paras and Quads. People are always posting accessible locations they've been to on here, or people just outright ask questions and say, hey, has anybody been to this location? Can you recommend for me a hotel or a place? So that's another option to do some research, is just on Facebook. It's amazing what's out there. Okay, and next slide, please. This is an Airbnb. I just wanted to show you what I eyeballed. This is in an Airbnb that I've rented 3 times now in Puerto Vallarta, and it is amazing. It's indoor outdoor living. It's 5,000 square feet, where the walls retract back. And so it's like indoor outdoor living. There's no steps anywhere. So you can see how just beautifully accessible this is. And what's incredible about this is every bathroom had an ensuite, and the ensuites all had just completely accessible walk-in, roll-in showers. So again, it was like universally designed. So this, I keep going back here because I love it because it's so accessible. It's so easy. And it's in a unit overlooking the water, as you can see, but it's got its own restaurant downstairs. It's amazing. So you could just, everything is self-contained. So that's something else just to look at. Eyeball pictures, and you can easily do it that way too. Booking flights. Okay, this is a big one. And you got to do a lot of research and reconfirming when it comes to booking flights. And I've got a lot of tips for you here. What I would recommend is if you're going to any destination, try and find the most direct route. There's less chance of missing connecting flights. There's less risk of losing your wheelchair or any other adapted equipment. It's also a lot less stress. Sometimes you can't find direct flights to your destinations, but if you can, it's worth, going to expedia.ca and just punching in, to from your destination. And they do have a button that actually you can press for direct flights. I always hit that first to try and find my flight. And if you're booking it through an agent, whether it's through your points, through, credit cards, through your bank, and you're working with an agent, I always insist that my file is flagged that I'm traveling with a wheelchair and I have a disability. So as much as you can, you want people to know at the airports, the airlines to know that they should expect somebody with a disability coming. So right from the get-go, when I book with an agent, if I'm not booking through Expedia, I let them know, please flag my file. And then they can also please let the airline know I have a disability. And then what I do is I then call the airline, and I always try and book myself a bulkhead seat in advance. They used to be able to just book it at no charge. Now they charge you about $30. But for me, it's worth it, especially on long flights, because the extra bulkhead room you get for your legs, that way you can move your legs around a bit more. For me, I'm at risk of blood clots when I'm on a flight. So I want to have as much room as possible to stretch and move my legs. I also find it much easier to transfer into a bulkhead seat from the little aisle chair you have to transfer onto to get onto the flight and get to your seat on the plane. I always recommend to get to the airport at least 30 minutes before you're advised to arrive. So I think now they say 2 or 3 hours with COVID. I always go even an hour above and beyond that, because sometimes, again, you get there, they're not expecting someone with a disability, even though you flagged the file, you called, you'd be amazed how there is miscommunication. So I always arrive super early so I can just kind of avoid any potential hazard. And at Pearson, now they used to have, I think with COVID, they've taken it away, an accessible area counter that you would go to. Now they've integrated into the regular counters, but you will see a blue and white wheelchair sign. Look for it and go there, and they will be more aware of your special needs. Ensure you've got that bulkhead seat. Ensure they know that passenger with a disability is coming, and insist that you can, if you want, that you keep your own mobility device right up until you get to the door of the airplane. A lot of airports, airlines would prefer, for their own ease, that you get into one of their wheelchairs and they just take your wheelchair right away and then take it down to the aircraft. It doesn't work for me because I need my independence to wheel through the airport, my independence to use the washroom before I get on the aircraft. So I always insist that I will keep my wheelchair until I get to the door of the airplane, and then they can take it. And if you do require what they call a Washington aisle chair to get into the aircraft, remind them they need it. They should know. But again, I've sometimes gotten to the gate And even though I've checked in, they know my wheelchair is coming, they forget to bring the aisle chair. So remind them at every point you possibly can. And look for accessible designated lines when you're going through security, when you're going through customs, anything. It makes it quicker, faster. You can scoot through. Usually they'll put you through the lines with the pilots or other airline employees, and you can like bypass sometimes lines that are hours long. So always look for the wheelchair sign to scoot through the airports and get through customs or security faster. Okay, next slide. Again, lots of tips here, guys. So these slides can be made available to you if you want. You always have to go to the gate, right? And usually wait a few minutes before you get on the aircraft. I always go super early. Again, just to make sure the aisle chair is there. But I also want to make sure they understand that I need to pre-board first. So this is a legal requirement by the airlines, by the airports, that passengers with disabilities legally must be boarded first. And so they also need to take your spouse or your friend or whoever's traveling with you to assist you. So this is so important because it's a matter of, number one, your safety. So you're not rushed to get on the aircraft. It's a matter of your dignity so you can do whatever you need to do to get on that aircraft. But also it's just less stress. I've had airports, airlines forget to pre-board me, and then suddenly you're doing it last while everybody is trying to, find their overhead compartment to put their luggage in, and it can just be awful. And you're like, excuse me, trying to get around them. So always make sure they do the pre-board, remind them first. And another little trick, when you're at the gate, there's absolutely no harm in asking if there's room up front. I would say about 50% of the time that I fly, it's easier for me. It's also easier for the staff on the aircraft to transfer you into a business or a first class seat because there's more room. So often they just do it automatically for me. But I always just say, hey, is there any room up front? And they know it's easier for all involved and it's a much more enjoyable flight. So no harm in asking, right? Again, if you do require an aisle chair, remind them. I've had them forget to the point where the flight had to leave. They couldn't find an aisle chair, and I've had pilots have to carry me on the flight, and they're not amused at all. Not by me, but they're not amused by the fact that staff, the ground crew, forgotten the aisle chair. And I also, if you have a mobility device that needs to go under the aircraft, a wheelchair or a walker, make sure that there is a gate tag on that piece of equipment. So what that means is if your wheelchair, your walker goes under the belly of the airplane, that when you land, it's a neon tag that they know they have to bring that mobility back up to the door of the airplane the minute it lands, so it's there for you. And this has happened to me in the past too. They've taken my wheelchair down to luggage. It's awful because greater chance of being broken as it goes down the luggage cart and is spinning around with all the bags. But also then you have to use their wheelchair, which doesn't fit you and it's unsafe, to get down to baggage, and you have to transfer into your own wheelchair. It's just, again, it's the dignity that's removed. So get a gate tag on your mobility device and ensure it's brought back up. And something else I always do is when they start to do the approach for landing and everybody has to put their seats up, seatbelt on, I always ask one of the staff on board to please ask the pilot to call ahead so the ground crew know they've got to bring my wheelchair up to the door of the airplane, right? So it's a lot of repetition here, but it can save you so much stress and hassle. And a couple other tips: always do a preventative pee, depending on the length of your flight, before you get on the plane, because sometimes those washrooms are just so small, and even though they have little onboard wheelchairs, it's really difficult to maneuver in a wheelchair. So always do a pre-board pee so you don't have to pee when you're on the flight. I also stop drinking 6 hours before I get on a flight to basically dehydrate myself. I don't drink anything on the flight because I don't want to have to pee when I'm on the flight. And again, there you go. Just remind the flight when you land to bring your mobility device up. Okay, so there's lots of tips there for you. I would also say prepare for potential mishaps as much as I planned. As you can see with all my strategies here, things happen. So I've had wheelchairs broken. I've landed and they've returned my wheelchair missing a wheel. I've had luggage lost, which can be a real problem if you've got medication in there that you need, if you have catheters that you need to pee with. So always take an onboard, a knapsack, a bag that has extra catheters, extra medications, extra anything you need in case your luggage gets lost. And if you have a wheelchair, make sure you take your cushion and any other removable pieces of equipment on that chair that might fall off and might get lost somewhere. So I always take my cushion off and put it in the overhead ahead of me. I cannot risk that being lost and getting a pressure sore on vacation if I don't have my cushion. Other ones is, and this has happened to me in my beginning stages of traveling, is you book an accessible room and then you get there. And again, everybody's definition of accessibility is different. And you go to your room and it's not accessible. And there was one instance in this, I remember my early days of traveling, I went to Amsterdam, said it was a fully accessible room. And what was remarkable is it truly was, it was this huge washroom. If you could get in it, it had the most narrow doorway though. And I have quite a narrow chair, but even my wheelchair wouldn't get through the doorway. If it could, then I would have been this huge, amazing, accessible washroom, but I couldn't fit through the door. So in cases like this, you just ask them to upgrade you to a suite or a bigger room at no extra cost. And they're more than willing to accommodate that. And in some cases, this happened to me 4 years ago. I was in New Mexico at a conference and I booked an accessible room and I got there and they'd given my room away to a physician. This is the irony, to a physician. And I said, well, I'm sure they'll understand. Give me my room back. It's accessible as the one I booked. And they weren't willing to do it, which I was quite shocked at. And I booked this months in advance because I knew I was speaking at this conference months in advance. So what they did is they booked me at the hotel next door. It was their sister hotel in like this beautiful suite. They were so mortified at what they'd done. And they'd given me this beautiful suite to make up for it, no extra cost. So again, don't be afraid to ask, because if someone else messes up that way, even though you've phone called and you've done all the picture scanning, you've done all your other checks, things happen. So don't be afraid to advocate for yourself and, ask for a different room, a bigger room. Okay, and the next slide here. Obviously, if you're going to locations in Europe where there's lots of cobblestones, check out and see if there is local disability organizations that have equipment that you can use. And what's remarkable in Europe, I find they give them to you for free. They let you borrow them for free. So like I go to the UK and I'm staying with family, they will give me shower chairs, whatever else I need for free. Like it's amazing, there's systems over there. So look for local disability organizations for things that you might need. It's great. The picture here I have, this is me in Rome. You can see the wheel that's kind of sticking out in front of my chair. It's called the free wheel. And this fits in my suitcase and it just attaches onto my foot plate. And this allows me to go over cobblestones without worrying about falling out of my wheelchair. So that's just kind of another little thing I take with me when I travel, just for my own ease. And this is us also, this is in Rome a couple of years ago. Don't be afraid to ask for help ever. I find no matter where I've traveled in the world, particularly if I'm on my own and I say, hey, can you give me a hand? Give me a lift up here, a step here. People are so willing to help. So don't ever be afraid to ask for help when you're on vacation. And then the last slide here is COVID travel. So, I mean, we're coming out of it, thank goodness, with Omicron, and we're starting to ease restrictions, which is amazing. I did recently travel over the Christmas, New Year's holidays. I went back to Puerto Vallarta, that place that I showed you pictures of a few minutes ago. And I have to say, it was very efficient, very smooth. I didn't run into any extra problems. Everything I've just mentioned about my strategies and tips, I applied to COVID travel. I got to the airport an extra hour ahead of what they recommended. And I just ensured, that, again, the gate tags, everything was taken care of. I didn't find it to be any more of a hassle with COVID travel, but I would just say follow all of the tips and strategies that I've given before, and it'll accommodate your COVID travel just as well. And that's it.